Jazzcast Pros.
In today's episode, our guest had a life-changing realization as he was getting ready for a date that he was struggling with depression and anxiety. How did this pivotal moment lead him to not only confront these challenges, but also write a book about his journey? Join us to hear his conversation. Welcome to Fearless Fridays with Maryann, the podcast to help you get unstuck, heal your inner child, and reshape your future. I am your host, Maryann Rivera-Dannard, and with over 10 years of experience as a coach, author, speaker, and owner of MRD Empowerment Solutions, I use my personal life experience with trauma, healing, and rediscovery as a catalyst for personal growth. My mission is to empower you to discover and unlock your full potential, paving the way to a life marked by freedom and balance. Together, we'll tackle the tough stuff and find the strength within to rise above. Today, we are thrilled to have an incredible guest with us who is the author of the mental health focused book series, Get Out of Your Head.
Yeah, I'm Brian Sachetta, the owner and author of Get Out of Your Head, which is a brand and book series that seeks to help folks overcome anxiety and depression.
Awesome. So can you take us back to the beginning of your 10-year battle with anxiety and depression? What were some of the initial challenges that you faced and how did they impact your life?
For sure. I do want to say that, mental health can be sort of an ongoing thing, right? Where it's like, I say that the 10 years that you alluded to are what drove me to write both of my books. And I made a lot of progress with both conditions, and that really made me want to turn around, take the information that I had learned and give back to the community, right? In the form of helping folks with that information. It's not to say that I'm perfect, not to say that I never deal with anxiety or depression anymore, but, I feel like I have some tools, and those tools are what I wanted to share with my audience and with the world. So yeah, on that 10-year journey, right? I mean, it started as just being sort of a boy, right? Like being an emotional kid, but not really wanting to express those emotions or really not wanting to express those emotions, if you will, right? So I opened the first book, which is centered around anxiety, on this story where I'm in college. I had met this girl that I liked, and we were sort of vibing a little bit, and she decides that she's going to come over one night. And I could tell via her text messages that she had been drinking and I had not. And I didn't have a ton of experience in the relationship department and was just nervous, like really nervous. So she comes over, and long story short, I basically have a panic attack in front of her because I don't know what to do. I had a different panic attack about 6 months before that in front of a different girl. And so it was really all I could think about for a long time because I didn't know what that was. I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to handle it. That second panic attack was sort of my entry point into, if I was writing a movie or whatever it were, if there were a movie about this journey, that would be the entry point where I wake up the next day and I'm utterly humiliated. I'm like, relationships mean a lot to me. And I just failed pretty badly in two important relationships, or seemingly important ones, back to back. And I just didn't know where else to turn. And so the next 10 years were basically me trying to figure out this thing called mental health, and at the time, do I even know if that is the label that I put on it? I'm not sure. Again, I didn't have much information at my disposal at that time. But then, for the next decade, I really dedicated myself to trying to figure this thing out, because I knew that if I wanted to succeed in my life, in my relationships, in my career and stuff like that, there would be more anxiety provoking scenarios. There would be some mental health challenges, right? Everybody goes through ups and downs, and those downs could bring about depression. And so I was like, as I was going through these different things, I tried to put on what I would say, an engineer's mindset or a scientific mindset, and saying, okay, I'm going to this specific situation and it makes me anxious. Let me try out some different tactics and see which of those work. And then, we'll bring them to another scenario and try to accumulate as much evidence as we can to then say, this is what seems to reliably work. And then these other things are what don't work as well. And obviously not everything that brings you anxiety is a scenario, right? Maybe it's just a place you are in your life, but those strategies can apply to both, moments in time or on the calendar, and then also some of just the situational or life moment stuff that you go through. So that was the frame through which I wrote both of those books. And that's the work that I do in general, is just trying to share my story and share those insights with people who are interested in hearing them.
I love that. So the second book in the series, Get Out of Your Head, Volume 2, Navigating the Abyss of Depression. Can you give us a glimpse into some of the key lessons and experiences that you share in the book and some of the research and findings that you've learned along the way?
Yeah, so there's so much to talk about, right? I mean, it's a great question. I just don't know if I can synthesize the entire book down into a short answer. If I could give a preview, I guess what I would say, right, is you look at the research and you see that depression is a pretty complex disease. And so there's different frameworks for sort of evaluating diseases like depression or conditions like depression, right? So one of those frameworks is called the biopsychosocial model. And it's essentially one of those words. It's like a portmanteau is the name of a word like that, right? It's the combination of various words. And so you have bio, which is short for biological, psycho, which, maps to psychological, and then social, which is actually just its own word. But the framework is basically trying to say that because depression is complex, there are many factors involved in it, right? And they come from those three different buckets. So, for example, it's possible that maybe you have like a neurotransmitter issue or a chemical imbalance in your brain, right? And that would be a biological issue that might bring upon your depression. However, you may also, for example, think negative thoughts all the time or have negative thoughts all the time. That might fall into, say, the psychological bucket. And maybe on top of that, you work a job that you don't enjoy, that's really stressful, that, you have a manager that is, doesn't recognize you, doesn't treat you well. Those kinds of stressors would fall into the social bucket. And so the second book is more of a holistic approach where I'm trying to say, look, we've got this complex disease. We have these holistic frameworks for evaluating them. And so if we think about it that way, we almost need to look at our own depression through that lens and say, what are those various subjects, topics, buckets, whatever we want to call them, that are maybe affecting us, right? And you think about like, okay, well, maybe you get out of that job, but you're still not feeling like yourself, right? There are many inputs to a complex disease like depression. So the book is basically me taking the reader on a journey to help them think about their own life and begin to reconstruct it in a way that supports the biological, the psychological, and the social. If I get a little bit out of the abstract and go into the concrete a little bit, right? So there's some research that came out. I want to say it was 2015, but I might be wrong. There was a research around this protocol called the Unpredictable Chronic Mild Stress Protocol, the UCMS protocol. And so what it's basically trying to say, or the research, what it puts forth is that, if you take mice or rats, which obviously aren't humans, but, I think there's some overlap there, and you subject them to stressors that are, going back to the name itself, unpredictable, chronic, and mild. So that would mean, like, for example, shining flashlights into the rat's cage, tipping over their beds, messing with their food and water supplies, putting a predator into the cage. If those things are unpredictable in the sense that they don't come every day at the same exact time, and they're not the same exact things every time, eventually what happens, right, or can happen, is the brain can say, look, I am experiencing all these stressors, and as they come on, I'm getting us ready for battle, right? I'm preparing the fight or flight nervous system. I'm revving it up so that when that stressor comes on, or as soon as I see it, whoosh, I'm running away. I'm trying to get away from that stressor. However, if over time, where those stressors remain present and they remain unpredictable, as in like any waking moment, they could come on. And also, they I guess they can't be so strong, right? The mild piece is important as well. It's like, it's not, this kind of bad analogy, but it's not somebody holding a gun up to your head every day, right? Because that would be a different realm that we'd be talking about. But so basically, after a certain amount of time following this protocol or being subjected to this protocol, basically these rats or mice, they fell into a depressive state where they were like, you know what? Essentially, right? Obviously, they can't talk, but they're like, if they could talk, I think what they would say is, I'm so stressed out all the time. I have no idea where this stress is going to come from, or at the very least, like maybe there's 5 sources of it, but I don't know when it's going to arrive and which flavor is going to arrive. And it just keeps happening. And so eventually they're like, you know what? Why even try to run away from this stuff? I am powerless to change it. And so the reason why I told that story both here and in the book is because I wanted folks to know that, like, to evaluate their own environments and say, if you are constantly under stress from different places and different
Right.
sources in your life. And it's not going away, and it's mild, right? Again, it's not somebody holding a gun up to your head every day. It is possible that subconsciously your brain may say, look, all this stress just won't go away. And so what else are we to do? Let's just fall back into learned helplessness. And I guess how that manifests sometimes is the feeling of depression, right? So again, I just asked readers to say, like, evaluate your life, see if maybe, social media is contributing to some of those things. Maybe, again, going back to your work environment or your friends and family, are you experiencing stress in those domains? So, life is certainly stressful these days. And I think that's why something like the UCMS protocol is probably more important to think about than ever before.
Starting a conversation about mental health can sometimes be challenging, especially as a man, because, society, they have the standard, against men, that they have to look a certain way, be a certain thing. Men typically don't talk about, their mental health challenges. So how do you approach breaking that stigma and encouraging open discussions about anxiety and depression?
It really comes down to leverage, right? If you are not, and I don't say this to make light of what anybody is going through, but what I'm getting at is basically, if you are experiencing some anxiety or some depression, but not an overwhelming amount, there isn't as much of a drive for you to say, I got to do something about this, right? And so there becomes a tipping point where you say to yourself, I am in so much pain, I have no choice but to talk about this stuff. And for me, like at various points in my life, it reached that limit. And so I don't, on the one hand, I don't necessarily want folks to have to go through that. But I also think that if we're talking about these societal norms or stigmas or whatever, sure, like anybody on any given day can say, I'm going to break through the stigma. I'm going to forget about that. And I'm just going to seek help, even if I'm not at my wit's end, right? But unfortunately, those stigmas are pervasive and they're sticky, right? And so for a lot of folks, it takes getting to the end of the rope before they're willing to do anything, right? And so I think that's one piece is like, I know it's not that actionable because unfortunately, like that's just, some scale in your mind saying like, we're ready now, like we have to break through and just go find help. But that's the reality of how it happens sometimes. I think the other piece, right, is I always foster, or I talk about and I say, I recommend that if you are struggling, like open up to somebody. It doesn't have to be, your boyfriend, girlfriend, brother, sister. It could be anybody. And that could be opening up to yourself and admitting that you're struggling and then calling a bunch of, therapists and being like, I'm trying to find somebody, a good consultant with whom I can work this stuff out. Right. So I guess until you admit to yourself and open up to yourself, it's going to be hard to get that help, right? Because unless somebody sees it in you, which they would have to be pretty astute/attentive in order to see that, right? It might not happen on its own. And so the second piece of the answer that I wanted to provide was, even though I certainly recommend that we all reach out to folks and get the help we need and get the support we need, because it's so important and we are very social creatures, it is equally important to gauge your audience correctly, right? Let's just say you're at like the local boxing gym and you're a guy, right? And you walk in there and you're crying and you're like, oh, my anxiety and depression, it's so bad. Look, I'm still in favor, like me, right? I'm still in favor of you talk to who you need to talk to get the help that you need.
Right.
However, in that environment, you may say to yourself, like, this is not the most inviting place for this conversation. And so maybe it would be wiser for me to talk to, a parent, a loved one in private, your PCP, your primary care physician, someone like that. So it's hard, these things can be nuanced, but I definitely, to kind of round out the answer, right? It's like, I'm certainly not saying that folks should hold these things in. It's just like, try to find the most efficient use or the best use of that initial reach out, that initial admission. And also, like, I understand how difficult this stuff is. I've been through it myself, and my heart goes out to everybody who's struggling with it. I'm not trying to make light of anything that somebody is going through, but I say all these things with a lot of love because I want to make sure I want to try to help the people who are listening and struggling. I want to try to help them get to the place that they're looking to get to as quickly as possible. And unfortunately, sometimes some of these nuances are required for that sort of thing.
Yeah. And one of the things that you said that was very key is that it's making that admission to yourself that something is wrong and that you need help. So what were some of the strategies, that you implemented for your healing process?
Why don't I start with anxiety, right? It was something that I did struggle with for a long time. And so, you read different books as you grow up or over time, and you hear sort of societal narratives, right? And one of the pervasive ones for me growing up, whether it was hearing it from coaches or teachers, role models, celebrities, and again, some of the books that I would read was this idea that anything that you wanted, right? So if you wanted, let's say, if you wanted to find an intimate partner, you needed to think about that first and allow yourself to accept the fact that it's going to happen. Basically, make it manifest in your internal world, in your mind, and then eventually you will see it come to fruition in the external world. There are books out there. I would just say it's sort of like a law of attraction sort of thing is what I'm referring to here. I don't want to name too many specific things if I don't have to.
Yeah.
And look, I'm not saying that my whole brand is basically like you find what works for you. And if that works, that's awesome. But I found that the sort of law of attraction angle did not work for me and did not work when it came to anxiety, because what would happen, right, is let's say I had a first date coming up. And again, maybe I didn't have a lot of experience on that front. And so I would sit down and I'd say, well, the law of attraction tells me that I got to visualize myself on that first date, doing really well, not being nervous, not being anxious. And then the next thing I know, while I'm carrying out this practice, I am sweating bullets. I am thinking about all these negative things that are popping into my head and whatnot.
Right.
And I kept saying to myself for years, I was like, okay, well, I'm just not that good at this yet, but eventually I'll get good at it. And then everything will fall into place. Yeah. And I'll tell you, that was when I first started that sort of process. That was like 15 years ago, and I look back 15 years later and I say to myself, I'm still not very good at that process, but it doesn't matter. Yeah. There are so many things, right, in my life. And I think other people can say the same thing, that if you're going on a date or you're jumping out of an airplane, you're doing something that scares you, you don't need to see it in your mind first, right? You also don't even need to have it on your radar, right? There are things in our lives that come out of nowhere, and those things are called surprises, right? If we really needed to think about those things first, there would be no such thing as a surprise. And so for me, giving myself the permission to say, look, dude, you're going on a date, you're going on a job interview, you're having an important, difficult conversation with a friend or a loved one. I know that your brain is trained or inclined to go into those ruminations, right? Those spirals of just continuing to say, what if this, what if that? But you need to step back and remind yourself of the evidence that you have of these different scenarios where you didn't think about those things. You didn't obsess over them and you still got what you wanted. Right. And so it gave me the permission to basically stop feeling so guilty about not being good at that process, let it go. And with that, a lot of the anxiety went as well. So that was one thing that's just really overarching. And if you look at Get Out of Your Head, the brand itself, that is really indicative of everything that I just said, was basically like, again, put the thoughts down, go do something else, get your mind on something entirely different from what you're thinking on right now.
Yeah. I love, the fact that you said, go back to that evidence from previous things that have happened and everything worked out. So you are on the Fearless Fridays podcast. How are you living a fearless life?
Wow. Fearless life. That's a good question. I like to be honest. Right now I'm probably not pushing myself as much as I need to. I've been dealing with some physical issues that have been a little bit challenging, but the fearless part of, putting this information out there and continuing to be a voice for folks who, don't know where else to turn, right? I mean, I could have years ago, and it stinks because I don't like to toot my own horn, but I feel like I kind of have to do it based on the question. There's folks out there that they're really struggling. They don't know where to turn to. And I could have a long time ago, I could have said, you know what? Not necessarily screw those folks, but forget about them and just do Brian and don't worry about putting out this information and whatnot. And, I've spent a lot of time crafting my books and my blogs and preparing myself for conversations like these ones. And again, I hate to toot my own horn, but at times that's scary, right? To put yourself out there to say, hey, I'm going on this podcast and I may sound like I know what I'm talking about, but I have dealt with anxiety and I have dealt with depression and I'm not perfect, But oddly enough, when you make those admissions, things get better. And so I don't want to glamorize it and say lean into the fear because fear is fear and it's tough, right? But try to head where you're trying to head, even if there is fear there, and try to persist to the degree that you can. Sometimes it gets overwhelming, but eventually it usually leads to pretty good places.
Yeah. And I love that. It's lean into it and do it with caution, and the fact of being fearless does not mean that there's no fear there. it's pretty much you're facing that fear and you're doing the thing anyways. So speaking of your brand, what are you looking forward to, ahead? What's in the future for Get Out of Your Head series?
I'm working on a slight edit or a revision of the first book, just because it came out 5 or 6 years ago and my writing has improved. And I just want to make sure, right? Like if somebody finds my content, I catch them and entice them, and I provide as much value as I can. I look back and I say, I'm still very proud of that book, and it helps a lot of folks, but I just want to make sure it's as good as it can be. And so that's my current big project. The next immediate task would be sort of boring stuff in terms of the consumer. It's really just like back office stuff, doing SEO, trying to work on marketing and expand my reach a little bit. I am excited to get back into blogging, which I have not had as much time to do as I've been, dealing with some physical issues, and then also trying to work on the revision of the first book. It's amazing how much headspace you need for a manuscript, right? It's like all the reference points and all that and whatnot. One way or another, I want to keep the message alive. I want to keep folks informed of the latest, greatest stuff. So it'll keep going, but just a matter of what medium and form. That is somewhat up in the air right now.
So speaking of books and blogs, where can our, listeners and our viewers connect with you and purchase your books?
Best place to go would be getoutofyourhead.com. So that's all one word. There's no dashes, no spaces in that. You'll find my books there, my blogs there. My podcast episodes tend to be more on Instagram. The handle there is also Get Out of Your Head. No dashes, no spaces in that either.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to capture all of that in our show notes. Any last parting words as we wrap up?
Dealing with this stuff is hard, and you have to give yourself credit for it, because there are times where it is really difficult. And there's times also where, you read a book or a blog or whatever, and this stuff gets a little glamorized, but, lean into the fear and all that, right? But at the end of the day, this is difficult stuff, and your mental health is really important. So remember to prioritize that. And also, again, my heart goes out to folks who are struggling with this stuff, because I've been there before. I know that it's not easy. And I want to see people feel better, because it's an amazing thing to see that, especially when somebody is, really in the pit of despair, to come back alive from that. It's really touching, and it means a lot.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing a part of your journey and story with us.
Thanks, Maryann. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to leave a 5-star review and share with a friend or two. If you're not already following us on social media, come join the Fearless community at MRD Empowerment Solutions on Facebook or Instagram, or visit our website, MaryannRiveraDanert.com. I'll catch you next week with a new episode, and remember that you are a priority and you matter.